When I was 12, my life flipped upside down. Up until that point, things were pretty normal, or so I thought. My name is Emily, and I'm 17 now, but I still remember the day my parents sat me down and told me they could no longer take care of me. They claimed financial struggles were to blame, and I was sent to foster care with barely an explanation. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I didn't understand how two people who were supposed to love me could just leave. At first, I believed them. They said they had no choice, that it was temporary, and that they'd figure things out. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. My foster parents, the Thompsons, were kind and patient, which was a relief considering how much anger and confusion I carried. They did their best to make me feel at home. Despite everything, though, I kept holding on to the hope that my parents would come back. Then one day, about a year after they'd left, I stumbled across their social media profiles. It felt like someone had sucker punched me. Instead of the financial struggles they'd claimed, I found photos of them sipping cocktails on beaches, posing in front of landmarks, and talking about how free their new lifestyle made them feel. They had become full-time travelers, living their so-called dream while I was stuck in foster care trying to piece my life back together. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They even had a travel blog, complete with pictures and captions like, "Living our best lives," and "Grateful for this amazing journey." There was no mention of me, my little brother Jake, or the life they left behind. I read every post obsessively, hoping for some kind of explanation, but all I found was their endless bragging about how much they loved their new life. Jake, I later learned, had been sent off to boarding school, like some unwanted afterthought. That was the moment I knew I couldn't count on them anymore. My heartbreak turned into something else. Determination. If they weren't going to be there for me, then I'd have to figure it out myself. The Thompsons helped me a lot during that time. They weren't rich or flashy like my parents pretended to be, but they were kind. They made sure I had what I needed, encouraged me in school, and gave me a sense of stability I hadn't realized I was missing. I threw myself into my studies, joining every club and extracurricular I could. It was my way of staying busy, but also my way of proving to myself that I could rise above the situation. I met my best friend Sarah that year. She had this ability to make everything feel normal, even when my life was far from it. She didn't judge me when I told her my parents had left, or when I vented about how unfair it was. She just listened, and honestly, that made all the difference. But my parents weren't done shaking up my life. One day, while scrolling through their blog again, because let's be honest, I couldn't stop checking, I saw a new post. This one hit harder than the others. They'd just returned from some exotic island, raving about how simplifying their lives had given them true happiness. The whole thing made me sick. I sent them a long, angry email, laying out everything I felt, how abandoned I was, how unfair it was that they got to live this glamorous life while I had to start over from scratch. Their response: a short, dismissive reply that said I was being ungrateful and didn't understand their sacrifices. That was the last straw. I decided then and there to cut them out of my life entirely. If they wanted freedom, they could have it, just not at my expense. With the help of the Thompsons, I started learning about saving money and setting goals. I got a part-time job and saved every penny I could. By the time I turned 16, I had a small savings account and the determination to make it grow. That year, I also found out I'd qualified for a scholarship. It wasn't just any scholarship either. It covered nearly everything. I still remember the look on Mrs. Thompson's face when she found out. She was so proud she almost cried. Hearing her talk about me like that made me realize how far I'd come. By the time I turned 17, I was thriving. I'd won an academic excellence award, which got a lot of attention online. I'd posted about it, excited to share my accomplishment, only to see a comment from my parents. They wrote something generic, like, "So proud of you. Let's reconnect soon." It was infuriating. They hadn't been there for me. And now that I was finally succeeding, they wanted to swoop back in? No way. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on my future. I had a plan, and I wasn't going to let them derail it. I'm 17 now, and things have started to look up for me. Against all odds, I secured a full ride to an Ivy League school to study business. The Thompsons were ecstatic when I told them, and honestly, their excitement made the moment even better. It felt like everything I'd worked so hard for was finally paying off. I packed my things and moved into my dorm, determined to make the most of this opportunity. In my first semester, I landed an internship at a major investment firm. It wasn't glamorous, mostly data entry and shadowing, but it was a foot in the door. I didn't mind starting small. Every experience was a step closer to my goal of financial independence. A few months into my first year, I got an email from my parents. It was the first time I'd heard from them in years. They wrote about how things had been difficult lately and mentioned that they were proud of my accomplishments. At first, I thought it was a generic attempt to reconnect. Then, towards the end of the email, they slipped in a comment about how hard it was to make ends meet and how they'd appreciate any help I could offer now that I was doing well. I didn't respond. I'd cut them out for a reason, and I wasn't about to let them worm their way back into my life now that they needed something. Ignoring them felt like the right move, but they didn't stop there. A few weeks later, I got a message from Jake. Jake and I hadn't talked much since everything happened. He'd been sent to boarding school when we were kids, and our parents kept us so separate that it felt like we'd grown up in different worlds. When I saw his name pop up on my phone, I wasn't sure what to expect. He apologized for being distant and told me our parents had been contacting him, trying to get through to me. He mentioned that they were pressuring him to help bring the family back together and had even guilted him about how I'd abandoned them. I invited Jake to visit me at school. I hadn't seen him in years, and I needed to know what was really going on. When he showed up, he looked different, older, but also tired in a way that didn't seem right for someone his age. Over coffee, he told me about his life at boarding school. It sounded strict and miserable, the kind of place that broke kids down instead of building them up. Then he dropped the bombshell. Our parents were broke. They'd been struggling for a while, maxing out credit cards to keep up the image of their dream life. Jake told me they were back in the US, now trying to become travel influencers, but it wasn't working. They'd burned through their savings and were in serious debt. Apparently, they'd started selling off personal belongings just to stay afloat. Hearing this didn't surprise me as much as it probably should have. I knew their lifestyle wasn't sustainable, but it still felt strange to have confirmation. Jake mentioned that he was planning to leave boarding school early and stay with friends because he couldn't take it anymore. I supported his decision and told him to let me know if he ever needed help. Meanwhile, my internship was going well. I must have done something right because they offered me a part-time paid position during the school year. Balancing work and classes wasn't easy, but I'd gotten used to juggling responsibilities. It felt good to know I was earning my own money and building a future that no one could take away from me. Things got a little weird when my parents started popping up on my LinkedIn posts. They commented on one of my updates about the internship, writing something along the lines of how proud they were of me and how they'd love to catch up. It made my skin crawl. I didn't want my professional network seeing those comments. I talked to my boss about it, and she advised me to block them if it became a distraction. That's exactly what I did. Around this time, I started a side hustle teaching financial literacy to other students. It was something I'd picked up from the Thompsons, who taught me how to manage money when I was still in foster care. The hustle gained traction faster than I expected, and soon I was running workshops and creating resources. It felt good to give back, especially knowing how many people didn't get this kind of guidance growing up. Then a family friend reached out to me with some unexpected news. They told me my parents were on the verge of bankruptcy. Apparently, their attempts at being travel influencers hadn't panned out, and they were drowning in debt. Hearing this was bittersweet. On one hand, it was a reminder of how far I'd come without them. On the other hand, it was hard not to feel a twinge of sadness for how far they'd fallen. By the end of that year, I felt more secure than ever. I had a part-time job, a growing side hustle, and a clear path forward. Jake was out of boarding school and staying with friends, which was a relief. As for my parents, they were still floundering, trying to maintain the illusion of their perfect life while everything crumbled around them. I didn't know what their next move would be, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let them drag me down with them. By the time I turned 22, I had officially graduated with honors, a business degree in hand, and a six-figure job lined up at a top firm. It felt like the culmination of years of grinding, from working part-time jobs to building my side hustle. The Thompsons and Jake were by my side every step of the way, cheering me on, while my parents had stayed on the periphery, popping up occasionally with their desperate attempts to reconnect. I thought I had prepared for anything, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on graduation day. The ceremony was perfect until it wasn't. I walked across the stage, shook hands with the dean, and felt a wave of pride as I saw the Thompsons and Jake in the crowd clapping for me. Afterward, we gathered outside to take pictures. That's when I saw them. My parents, standing at the edge of the crowd, looking out of place and clearly waiting for the right moment to make their move. They didn't wait long. As soon as I turned around, they walked straight toward me, cutting through the crowd. They acted like no time had passed, like we were some picture-perfect family here to celebrate my big day together. My dad started talking about how proud they were of me, while my mom got emotional, saying they'd made mistakes but had always wanted the best for me. They claimed they'd been misguided and that everything they did was for the family. Their tone changed when I didn't react the way they wanted. I calmly reminded them that they had abandoned me when I was 12, left Jake in a joyless boarding school, and lived their dream life while we both struggled. I told them that showing up unannounced and making a scene wasn't the way to fix things. Then I asked them to leave. They looked stunned, like they hadn't expected me to stand my ground. Jake stepped in at that point, telling them he was done with their manipulation. He said that after everything they had put us through, they had no right to disrupt this moment. It was the first time I'd seen him stand up to them like that, and I could tell it wasn't easy for him. Our parents didn't argue. They just walked away, blending into the crowd as quickly as they had appeared. The Thompsons were the opposite. They called the day a celebration of how far I'd come and said they couldn't be prouder to call me their daughter. We took more pictures, ate dinner, and made the day everything it was supposed to be, about my hard work and the people who had truly supported me. But my parents weren't finished. Over the next few weeks, they tried every avenue to get back into my life. They contacted distant relatives and old family friends, telling them I was ignoring them and refusing to forgive them for the sake of family unity. A cousin reached out, warning me that my parents were considering suing me for financial support. At first, I thought it was a bluff, but the more I heard, the more serious they seemed. I consulted a lawyer, who assured me they didn't have a case, since I'd been placed in foster care and had no legal obligation to them. Their threats were empty. Still, the fact that they would even consider suing me showed just how far they were willing to go. When that didn't work, they turned to social media. They started posting long rants about how I was an ungrateful daughter who had forgotten her roots. They painted themselves as victims, claiming they had sacrificed everything for me and Jake only to be abandoned in their time of need. Their posts were dramatic and full of half-truths, but I knew better than to engage. My colleagues and friends saw the posts and rallied around me, reminding me to focus on my work and let the noise fade into the background. Meanwhile, my side hustle had taken off. What started as workshops and resources for students had grown into a full-fledged consulting business. I was running webinars, collaborating with schools, and even speaking at events about financial literacy. It felt surreal to watch something I'd built from scratch become so successful, and it gave me even more confidence to keep moving forward. My parents, however, weren't done stirring up drama. They somehow found my boss's contact information and reached out, claiming I owed them for my success and accusing me of being ungrateful. My boss thankfully saw right through their nonsense. She told me about the email they'd sent and advised me to ignore it. She even joked that they were only proving how strong I was for rising above such a toxic situation. Jake took things a step further. He made a public post on his own social media, defending me and exposing our parents' actions. He wrote about how they had abandoned us, tried to guilt us into helping them, and even threatened legal action when things didn't go their way. His post gained traction, with people sharing it and calling out my parents for their behavior. I decided it was time to address the situation myself. I made a brief public statement, acknowledging the lies my parents had spread and clarifying that I had no intention of reuniting with them. I kept it professional and focused on the truth, then shifted the focus back to my work and the future. The drama didn't stop my momentum. If anything, it fueled me to keep pushing forward. My business continued to grow, and the support from Jake, the Thompsons, and my colleagues only made me stronger. My parents' attempts to tear me down had failed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely in control of my own story. By the time I turned 24, I had reached another major milestone: buying my first home. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that everything I'd worked for was finally paying off. The house was a cozy, modern place in a quiet neighborhood, and I couldn't wait to fill it with memories. To celebrate, I invited the Thompsons and Jake over for a housewarming. They'd been my rock through everything, and it felt right to share this moment with them. The day of the party was perfect. The house was decorated with flowers and lights, and I'd ordered way too much food. The Thompsons brought a homemade cake, and Jake showed up early to help set up. We spent the afternoon laughing, sharing stories, and talking about how far we'd all come. It was everything I'd hoped for, until the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone else, so I opened the door without thinking. Standing there, looking disheveled and out of place, were my parents. They told me they were homeless and had nowhere else to go. They asked to come inside, saying they needed my help. It felt like a scene out of a bad movie. I didn't let them in. I told them they couldn't just show up uninvited after everything they'd done. They didn't take it well. They started yelling, accusing me of being heartless and ungrateful. The commotion drew the attention of my neighbors, a few of whom came outside to see what was going on. I stayed calm and told my parents they needed to leave. When they refused, I had no choice but to call security. Security arrived quickly and escorted them off the property. The entire altercation was caught on camera by one of my neighbors, who later posted it online. Within hours, the video went viral. People were shocked by my parents' behavior and overwhelmingly supportive of how I handled the situation. But my parents weren't done causing trouble. A few days later, a tabloid published an article featuring my parents' side of the story. They painted themselves as victims, claiming I'd abandoned them in their time of need. The article was full of lies, but it didn't take long for people to start connecting the dots. Comments on the story were overwhelmingly in my favor, with many pointing out their history of manipulation and entitlement. My lawyer quickly issued a cease and desist letter, shutting down the story before it could gain more traction. It was exhausting to deal with, but I wasn't about to let them tarnish everything I'd built. My focus stayed on my work, which was gaining momentum in ways I never expected. My consulting business was now nationally recognized for its work empowering young adults. I was invited to speak at events, collaborate with nonprofits, and even contribute to educational programs. It felt surreal to see something I'd started as a side hustle grow into a movement that was genuinely helping people. Around this time, I reconnected with Sarah, my best friend from high school. We drifted apart during college but quickly picked up where we left off. She became one of my biggest cheerleaders, always reminding me of how far I'd come and helping me stay grounded. Having her back in my life felt like another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Meanwhile, Jake updated me on our parents' situation. They were living in a rundown motel, still trying to maintain appearances despite their obvious struggles. Hearing this didn't bring me any satisfaction. It just reinforced how much I needed to keep my boundaries. Then, something unexpected happened. A documentary crew reached out, interested in telling my story. They wanted to highlight my journey from foster care to success, focusing on the challenges I'd faced and how I'd overcome them. I agreed, not for the attention, but for the chance to shed light on the flaws in the foster care system. If my story could inspire even one person, it would be worth it. As filming began, word got back to my parents. They weren't happy. They sent me a message threatening to sue for defamation if they were mentioned in the documentary. My lawyer assured me they had no case, especially since I wasn't planning to name them directly. I moved forward with the project, refusing to let their threats hold me back. When the documentary premiered, it received massive attention. People from all walks of life reached out to share their stories, thank me for speaking out, or offer their support. It was overwhelming in the best way. The film opened doors I never imagined, from new business opportunities to partnerships with organizations dedicated to reforming the foster care system. Predictably, my parents tried to use the documentary to their advantage. They made a public apology, claiming they'd changed and wanted to make amends. But it was clear they were more interested in the attention and potential financial gain than in genuine reconciliation. I didn't respond. I had more important things to focus on. With Sarah, Jake, and the Thompsons by my side, I stayed focused on my work and the life I was building. My parents could spin their stories however they wanted. It didn't matter anymore. Their actions only reminded me of how far I'd come and how much power I had over my own narrative. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. Not long after the documentary aired, Jake called me with an update about our parents. He'd kept tabs on them out of morbid curiosity, and what he found wasn't surprising. They'd been evicted from the rundown motel they were staying in for non-payment. From what Jake gathered, they were now living out of their car, still blaming me for their downfall. Jake shared this news with a tone of frustration, but also relief. He was beginning to see through their endless excuses and manipulations. Despite their situation, they were still acting like victims, telling anyone who would listen that I had turned my back on family. It was the same tired story, just in a different setting. Around that time, I received an unexpected invitation to speak at a global financial empowerment summit. It was a huge honor and completely out of the blue. The summit featured some of the biggest names in the industry, and I was thrilled to be included. My work with financial literacy had gained recognition, and this was another opportunity to share what I'd learned and hopefully inspire others. The event was incredible. The venue was massive, with a packed audience and cameras broadcasting live to an even larger online crowd. I was halfway through my talk when I noticed a commotion at the back of the room. It didn't take long to figure out what was happening. My parents had shown up and were trying to get past security. They were yelling about how I was ignoring my real family and how they deserved a chance to speak. Security quickly intervened and escorted them out before they could cause a bigger disruption. The incident didn't faze me as much as it might have years ago. I finished my talk, focusing on the audience in front of me. Later, when clips of the event started circulating online, many people commended how calmly I handled the situation. Some even speculated about who the disruptive pair were, but I left it alone. It wasn't worth addressing publicly. After the summit, I reconnected with some distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. They'd seen the documentary and reached out to tell me how proud they were of everything I'd accomplished. A few of them shared stories about my parents from before they left me and Jake, stories that painted a clearer picture of their pattern of selfish behavior. It was validating to know that others saw through their facade, even before things fell apart. Not long after, my parents took their antics to the next level. They started crowdfunding campaigns, claiming they were destitute because I refused to help them. They framed it as a sob story about being abandoned by their successful daughter, conveniently leaving out their years of neglect and manipulation. The campaigns gained some traction at first, but it didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Multiple users flagged the campaigns for fraud, and they were eventually taken down. The backlash only worsened their reputation. While all this was happening, I quietly made arrangements to help Jake. He had been through so much, and I wanted to make sure he had the support he needed to heal. I found a therapist he trusted and set up educational resources to help him explore his own career goals. He'd always been smart and resourceful, and I wanted to give him every chance to thrive. Around the same time, a viral investigative article surfaced about my parents. A journalist had dug into their history and exposed years of exploiting others, from unpaid debts to manipulative behavior. The article detailed their pattern of blaming others for their failures and refusing to take responsibility. It spread quickly, and any remaining sympathy they had from the public vanished. With everything happening, I decided it was time for a break. I purchased a vacation home, a cozy cabin near the mountains, and invited Jake and the Thompsons for a holiday. We spent the week hiking, cooking meals together, and simply enjoying each other's company. One night, as we sat by the fire, Jake thanked me. He told me I'd given him the family he always wanted, and that he couldn't imagine where he'd be without my support. It was a moment I'll never forget. As I reflected on everything, I realized just how far I'd come. My parents, who once had so much control over my life, now had none. They'd been spotted working menial jobs, ignored by the public, and stripped of the influence they'd once wielded through manipulation. It wasn't about revenge, it was about knowing that I was no longer under their shadow. My consulting firm had expanded internationally by then, with offices opening in several countries. The work was fulfilling in ways I couldn't have predicted, and I was proud of the legacy I was building. Still, I felt a pull to give back even more. Inspired by my own experiences, I decided to donate a portion of my wealth to foster care reform. The money would fund scholarships, mentorship programs, and resources for kids like me who had been through the system. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I had the family I chose, the career I built, and the freedom to write the next chapter on my own terms. And that was more than enough. A few years after buying my first home, my life hit another major milestone. I got married. My partner, someone who had been my biggest supporter, shared my values and truly understood my journey, proposed in a way that felt simple yet meaningful, exactly what I wanted. We decided to keep the wedding small, inviting only those who had genuinely been there for me, the Thompsons, Jake, Sarah, and a few close friends. It was a day filled with love, laughter, and celebration. But of course, my parents tried to ruin it. On the day of the wedding, just as the ceremony was about to start, security informed me that two people were at the gate insisting they were family. It didn't take long to figure out who they were. My parents, true to form, had shown up uninvited. Security handled it quickly and professionally, escorting them away before they could cause a scene. I barely gave it a second thought. I wasn't going to let them disrupt one of the happiest days of my life. The wedding was everything I'd hoped for and more. The Thompsons gave a heartfelt toast, welcoming my partner into the family. Jake, who'd grown into a confident, thoughtful young man, shared his gratitude for the bond we'd rebuilt. A few months later, he officially changed his last name to distance himself from our parents. He told me it felt like closing a chapter and starting fresh. Around the same time, I received an award for my contributions to financial literacy and foster care reform. The ceremony was humbling, with so many incredible people in attendance, including leaders I'd admired for years. When I stepped on stage to accept the award, I saw the Thompsons and Jake in the audience, their smiles reminding me of how far we'd all come. It was a moment I'll never forget. Not long after, my parents sent a desperate letter. It was handwritten, filled with apologies, excuses, and pleas for help. I didn't read it. I couldn't. It wasn't about anger or resentment anymore. It was about protecting my peace. I placed the letter in a drawer and moved on, choosing not to let them take up any more space in my life. Shortly after, the Thompsons came to me with an idea that caught me off guard. They wanted to officially adopt me. I was already an adult, but they said it wasn't about legality. It was about making it official in their hearts. The process was surprisingly simple, and standing in the courthouse with them that day felt like closing one door and opening another. I finally had the family I'd always wanted. As if life wasn't full enough, a journalist reached out about writing a book inspired by my story. They wanted to dive deeper into my journey, not just to spotlight my success, but also to shed light on the systemic challenges faced by kids in foster care. I agreed, and the book turned into a bestseller, sparking conversations across industries and communities. Meanwhile, Jake was thriving. He graduated college, something our parents had once dismissed as unnecessary, with a degree he was passionate about. I'd funded his tuition, knowing it was an investment in a future he deserved. At his graduation, he gave a short speech thanking me and the Thompsons for believing in him. It was one of those full-circle moments that made everything feel worthwhile. As for my parents, the last I heard, they'd moved into a shelter. They'd burned every bridge and exhausted every resource. Their crowdfunding campaigns were flagged for fraud, and their manipulative tactics had alienated even the most forgiving relatives. It was a sad end, but it wasn't my responsibility to fix. In honor of the Thompsons, I funded a scholarship for foster youth, ensuring kids like me would have access to education and opportunities. The first recipients of the scholarship wrote letters thanking me, and their words reminded me why I kept pushing forward. At an event celebrating the initiative, I received a standing ovation that brought me to tears. It wasn't just about the recognition, it was about seeing lives change in real time. Sarah joined my consulting business around this time, fulfilling a lifelong dream of ours to work together. Her creativity and passion brought new energy to the team, and our partnership became one of the most rewarding parts of my career. I decided to cut the last remaining tie to my parents shortly after. I legally changed my last name, leaving behind the name that tied me to them. It felt like the final step in reclaiming my identity. Jake later shared a heartfelt post online, calling me the best sister he could have asked for and thanking me for everything I'd done. It went viral, with thousands of people commenting on the strength of our bond and the resilience we'd shown. Reading his words reminded me that, no matter what, we'd built something beautiful out of the wreckage our parents left behind. As I looked to the future, I felt nothing but pride. I had the family I chose, the career I built, and the ability to make a difference. My parents were just a shadow in the distance, a reminder of where I started but not where I was going. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free.